The sun had barely clawed its way over the jagged horizon when the rope tightened around the boy's neck. Dust swirled like angry ghosts across the square of Silver Bend, New Mexico territory, 1882. A crowd of hard-faced miners and ranch hands stood in silence, their boots planted in the red dirt, watching. The boy, no more than 12, dangled from the makeshift gallows, his small hands bound behind his back, bare feet kicking desperately at empty air. Colt Ramsey drove his spurs hard into the flanks of his big gray mare. Hiya, the horse, exploded forward through the crowd. People scattered, cursing. Colt leaned low in the saddle heart, hammering against his ribs like a war drum he thought he'd buried 3 years ago. The rope was already singing tight. The boy's face was turning purple. In one fluid motion, Colt drew the long knife from his boot and slashed upward. The blade bit through the rope with a sharp twang. The boy dropped like a stone into the dust, gasping, coughing, alive. For one frozen second, the entire square went dead silent. Colt swung down from the saddle boots, hitting the ground hard. He knelt beside the boy, cutting the ropes from his wrists with steady hands that betrayed none of the storm raging inside his chest. The kid's eyes wide, terrified, and shining with something dangerously close to hope locked onto his. "You're all right now, son," Colt said, his voice low and rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. "Breathe." But the moment shattered when a cold, silky voice cut through the morning air. Well, look what the desert dragged in." Colt rose slowly, turning to face the man standing on the raised platform. Silas Crow, the mayor of Silver Bend, dressed in a fine black coat that didn't belong in this dusty hellhole. His thin lips curled into a smile that never reached his eyes. Colt Ramsey Silas drawled, "I heard you hung up your guns. Retired. Ran away like a whipped dog after you couldn't stomach the real world anymore." Colt's jaw tightened. Memories flashed blood-soaked trails of friends dying because justice was sold to the highest bidder the day he threw his badge into the Rio Grande and swore he was done. He stepped forward anyway. "That boy didn't steal anything," Colt said loud enough for every man in the square to hear. "You know it. I know it. This whole town knows it. You're stringing up a child because you want his father's silver claim. That's not law, Crow. That's murder wearing a fancy coat." Silas chuckled softly, adjusting his gloves. "Careful, Ramsey. I still own this town. And words like that, they have a way of getting a man killed out here." Colt met his gaze without flinching. "I hung up my guns 3 years ago," he said, voice steady but carrying the weight of every regret he carried. "But today, I couldn't stand by and watch a boy die for your greed." The boy, Finn McCoy, clutched at Colt's sleeve, his small body still trembling. Those eyes again. Fear mixed with a fragile spark of trust that hit Colt harder than any bullet ever had. Silas's smile faded into something colder. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Ramsey. Before this week is over, you'll wish you'd kept riding." He turned and walked away, his 2 hired guns shadowing him like wolves. The crowd began to murmur, shifting uneasily. Some looked ashamed, most looked scared. Colt let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He looked down at Finn. "Come on, kid. Let's get you somewhere safe." He lifted the boy onto the gray mare, then swung up behind him. As they rode slowly through the waking streets of Silver Bend, the desert sun climbed higher, turning the sky into a furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the distant rocks like the land itself was breathing fire. Colt's mind raced. He had promised himself he would never get involved again, never wear that weight, never feel responsible for another life. Yet here he was. They stopped in front of the only saloon still standing in town, a weathered 2-story building with a faded sign that read, "Lila's Place." The owner, Lila Ford, stepped out onto the porch as they approached. She was a strong woman in her late 20s, dark hair, pinned-back eyes, sharp with the kind of hardness that came from losing too much too soon. She took one look at the boy's rope-burned neck and Colt's grim face, and her expression tightened. "Colt Ramsey," she said quietly, almost like a warning. "You really know how to stir up trouble, don't you?" Colt helped Finn down. "He needs a place to rest. Food, water, I'll pay." Lila's gaze lingered on the boy for a long moment. Something soft flickered behind her tough exterior, then vanished just as quickly. "Bring him inside," she said at last. "But if Silas Crow comes looking for blood, don't expect me to die for your conscience." Colt nodded once. He understood. As he guided Finn through the swinging doors, the desert wind picked up howling low across the rooftops, like a warning no one wanted to hear. Behind them, the noose still swayed gently from the gallows, empty now, but not forgotten. And somewhere in the heat haze, Colt felt the first chains of an old life tightening around him once more. This story is about what happens when one man finally decides he can't look away anymore. When ordinary courage chooses to stand against powerful greed, and when a broken soul discovers that protecting the innocent might be the only way to heal his own scars. The swinging doors of Lila's place had barely closed behind them when the weight of what he'd done settled heavy on Colt Ramsey's shoulders. Inside the dimly lit saloon, the air smelled of stale whiskey, old wood, and faint lavender soap. A few early patrons glanced up from their tables, then quickly looked away. No one wanted trouble with Silas Crow. Lila Ford stood behind the bar arms, crossed tight over her chest. Her dark eyes flicked from Colt to the trembling boy at his side, then back to Colt again. "You've got some nerve bringing him here," she said, her voice low but sharp as broken glass. "Silas already thinks he owns this town. Now you drag a wanted kid into my place. You're painting a target on all our backs." Colt gently guided Finn toward a chair near the stove. The boy's small hands still shook as he clutched the edge of the table. "I didn't have anywhere else," Colt replied quietly. His throat felt tight. "He's just a kid, Lila. They were going to hang him for nothing." Lila's jaw clenched. She wiped her hands on her apron harder than necessary. For a long moment she said nothing, only stared at the rope burn circling Finn's thin neck. "I lost my husband to Silas Crow's games 3 years ago," she finally whispered, her voice cracking just enough to show the wound beneath her anger. "One night his men came, said my husband owed money for protection. When he refused, they made an example of him. I buried him behind the church with my own hands." She looked away, blinking hard. "I'm not losing anything else because of you, Ramsey." Colt nodded slowly. He understood fear. He'd carried it like a second skin ever since he walked away from the Rangers. "I'll keep watch tonight," he said. "If trouble comes, I'll draw it away from you." Before Lila could answer, Finn spoke up, his voice small but steady. "Mr. Colt?" "You're really a Texas Ranger," before Colt hesitated, then pulled up a chair across from the boy. "Used to be." Finn's eyes brightened for the first time since the hanging. "My pa always said the best blacksmith in the territory is Old Ruiz. He makes horseshoes that never wear out. I want to be like him one day. Make things strong, that last." The boy's words hung in the air, fragile as morning frost. Colt felt something twist deep in his chest, a memory of his own childhood dreams, long burned away by years of violence and betrayal. The front door creaked open. An old man stepped inside, gray hair tied back with a leather cord, his weathered face marked by deep lines and old scars. "Old Ruiz." He moved with the quiet strength of someone who had survived more wars than most men ever saw. Colt Ruiz said, simply nodding once. His dark eyes took in the scene. The boy, the rope, burns Lila's tense shoulders. He walked over and placed a gentle hand on Finn's head. "You're safe here tonight, mijo." Later that evening, after the last customer had left and the lamps burned low, Ruiz sat with Colt on the back porch while Lila put Finn to bed upstairs. The old man rolled a cigarette with slow, deliberate fingers. "You remember what I told you after the war?" Colt Ruiz asked softly. "Sung chi get juochkethu?" "Nung long come to get chet chinmin?" Colt stared out into the dark desert. The wind whispered across the sand like distant ghosts. "I remember," he murmured. I thought if I walked away, maybe the hate would leave me too." Ruiz exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "Hatred doesn't leave. It waits. But protecting that boy upstairs, that's something different. That's choosing life again." Colt didn't answer. But deep down, something inside him, long frozen, began to crack. Over the next 2 days, the tension grew like a storm cloud on the horizon. Lila moved through the saloon with quiet strength, serving drinks while keeping one eye on the street. Colt noticed how she sometimes paused at the window, her hand resting on the wooden frame, as if bracing for bad news. Yet she still brought Finn warm meals and spoke to him gently when she thought no one was listening. Finn, in turn, began to smile, small, hesitant smiles that lit up his young face whenever Colt showed him how to clean a rifle, or when Ruiz told stories of Mexico before the war. Colt felt it happening against his will. The boy's quiet courage, Lila's stubborn kindness. They were pulling at threads he'd tried so hard to cut. Then came the third night. It started with the smell of smoke. Colt woke to the sharp crackle of flames. He bolted upright on the cot in the back room just as shouts erupted outside. "Fire!" He rushed into the main room. Lila was already there, pulling Finn toward the back door, her face pale with terror. Through the front windows, Colt saw them, Rufus Crow and 4 of his father's men, torches blazing in their hands. Rufus, tall and cruel like his father, grinned as he hurled another flaming bottle through the broken glass. "This is just a warning," Ramsey Rufus yelled into the night. "Next time we burn everything." And everyone inside. The saloon filled with thick black smoke. Flames licked up the curtains and crawled across the floorboards. Colt grabbed his rifle, but there was no time to fight. Not with the boy and Lila trapped. Out the back he shouted. Now they ran into the cool desert night, coughing, hearts pounding. Behind them, Lila's place roared with fire, years of her hard work turning to ash and embers that drifted upward like lost souls. They didn't stop running until the town lights faded behind them and only the vast starlit desert remained. Under a cold silver moon, Colt finally slowed. Finn's small body trembled violently against his side. The boy was crying silently now, trying so hard to be brave. Colt dropped to one knee in the sand and pulled Finn close, wrapping strong arms around the child's shaking frame. "It's all right," he whispered, voice rough with emotion he could no longer hide. "I've got you." As the boy's tears soaked into his shirt, Colt stared out across the endless dunes glowing under moonlight. He had run from responsibility for 3 long years. But tonight, holding this frightened child while the woman who had already lost so much stood nearby watching the smoke rise from her burning home, Colt Ramsey realized the truth. He couldn't run anymore. This story shows us that even the most broken hearts can find the courage to protect what matters. When one person chooses to stand up, it gives others the strength to heal and fight for a better tomorrow. The desert night was still burning behind their eyes when the 4 of them finally stopped running. Colt Ramsey crouched low on a rocky ridge, his gray mare tethered in a narrow wash below. Lila Ford knelt beside him, her breathing shallow and quick. Finn McCoy pressed close to her side, while Old Ruiz scanned the horizon with eyes that had seen too many battles. They had been moving since the fire, sticking to the shadows of the dunes, surviving on what little water Lila had grabbed before everything turned to ash. "I saw something last week," Lila whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Silas and his men loading crates at the edge of town. Not silver, rifles. Mexican bandits were waiting. Colt's stomach tightened. He had suspected corruption, but this was worse. Much worse. Old Ruiz nodded slowly. They're not just stealing claims. They're arming killers on both sides of the border. Silas gets rich, the bandits get guns, and the people here, they pay with blood. The decision came in the quiet hours before dawn. They would follow the next silver shipment. If they could prove the connection, maybe, just maybe, they could bring real justice to Silver Bend. 2 nights later, under a thin sliver of moon, the 4 of them lay hidden among the creosote bushes, overlooking the old trade trail. Hoofbeats approached. A line of wagons creaked forward, heavily guarded. Silas Crow rode at the front on a sleek black horse, his son Rufus beside him. 2 miners walked behind the last wagon hands, bound faces bruised. Colt felt Lila tense beside him. One of the miners suddenly cried out, "Please, Mr. Crow." "We won't say anything, just let us go." Silas reined in his horse. He looked almost bored. "You've already seen too much." Rufus raised his pistol without hesitation and fired twice. The shots cracked through the desert like thunder. Both miners dropped into the sand, their bodies still. Lila gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Before Colt could stop her, she bolted forward, driven by pure instinct. "No." She ran toward the fallen men, trying to reach the one still twitching. A bandit spotted her immediately. Intruder 2 men broke away from the wagons and charged after her. Colt's heart slammed against his ribs. His hand moved on its own, reaching for the Colt revolver he hadn't fired in 3 long years. Time slowed. Lila stumbled in the loose sand. One of the bandits grabbed her arm, yanking her back hard. Colt rose from cover. He aimed. The gunshots split the night. The bandit clutching Lila jerked violently and fell. For the first time in 3 years, Colt Ramsey had pulled the trigger and taken a life. The echo rolled across the dunes like judgment. Chaos erupted, shouts, more gunfire, horses rearing. Colt grabbed Lila's hand and dragged her back toward the ridge while Old Ruiz covered them, firing carefully to keep the pursuers at bay. They ran until their lungs burned and the wagons were far behind. Only when they collapsed in a hidden arroyo did the full weight hit them. Finn sat huddled against a rock, staring at Colt's hands. The boy had seen everything, the blood, the bodies, the flash of the gun. His small face was pale, eyes wide with horror. You shot him," Finn whispered, voice breaking. Then louder, raw with pain and fear, "You promised. You said you wouldn't let them kill anyone else." Tears streamed down his cheeks. "I don't want more blood. I don't want anyone else to die like my pa." Colt dropped to his knees in front of the boy. His own hands were shaking now. The familiar weight of the revolver suddenly felt like lead. "I'm sorry, Finn," he said, voice rough and low. "I didn't want to. But if I hadn't, they would have taken Lila." Old Ruiz placed a gentle hand on Colt's shoulder, his voice calm despite the fresh wound on his own arm from a grazing bullet. "Listen to me, mijo. Justice isn't about revenge. It's not about killing every bad man. Real justice is making sure the ones still breathing get to keep breathing. It's protecting what's left." Colt looked up at the old man, then at Lila, who was quietly wiping tears from her own face and finally at Finn, whose small shoulders still heaved with sobs. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the distant howl of coyotes. They stayed there until the sky began to lighten, 4 broken souls huddled together under the vast emptiness of New Mexico. When the first light of dawn touched the rocks, Old Ruiz spoke again softly. "Silas knows now. He'll put a price on your head, Colt. And on yours too, Lila. Word will spread fast across the territory." Colt stood slowly, helping Finn to his feet. He looked at each of them, the woman who had already lost her home, the boy who had lost his father, the old friend who refused to let hatred win. No one spoke the words out loud, but they all understood. There was no turning back. They were no longer running from the past. They were standing in the path of a storm that was coming straight for them. This story reminds us that the moment we witness true evil and still choose to protect the innocent, even at the cost of our own peace, that is when real courage begins to heal the deepest wounds inside us. The desert had never felt so heavy. Colt Ramsey moved like a shadow through the back alleys of Silver Bend, his hat pulled low. Lila Ford and Old Ruiz close behind. Finn McCoy stayed glued to Lila's side, his small hand clutching her sleeve. They slipped past sleeping dogs and shuttered windows, carrying the weight of everything they had witnessed in the dunes. They weren't running anymore. They were coming back to set a trap. Under the cover of night, Colt led them to the old silver vein on the edge of town and the same claim that had cost Finn's father his life. A handful of miners still worked there in secret too, afraid of Silas Crow to speak out. But fear has limits. Colt stepped into their hidden camp lantern light, flickering across tired, suspicious faces. "I know what Silas is doing," he said quietly. "He's not just stealing your silver. He's trading guns to the Mexican bandits. I saw the wagons. I saw the blood." He laid out the proof they had gathered, a stolen ledger page stained with desert sand, names, dates, routes. One by one, the miners' eyes changed. Anger replaced terror. Lila spoke next, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "If we stand together, we can end this. But we have to do it now, before more innocent people die." The miners listened. Some nodded, others hesitated, remembering friends who had already disappeared. Old Ruiz added softly, "A man who lives on his knees dies without ever tasting freedom. Tonight you choose." By midnight, a fragile alliance was born. But the desert has a way of ripping hope apart. They were moving toward the main shaft when Rufus Crow and 6 armed men burst from the darkness. Rufus's eyes lit with cruel satisfaction as he spotted Finn. Well, if it isn't the little thief. Before anyone could react, 2 men seized the boy. Finn cried out, struggling wildly as they dragged him away. Colt, the boy, screamed. Rufus pointed his pistol straight at Colt's chest, but his gaze slid hungrily toward Lila. "Give me the woman Ramsey. Hand her over and the boy lives. She belongs to me anyway. Always has." Lila's face went pale. Colt saw the terror flash in her eyes and the same fear she had carried since the night her husband was murdered. Colt's blood turned to ice. He took 1 step forward, voice dangerously calm. "You touch either of them, and there won't be enough sand in this desert to hide what's left of you." Rufus laughed and melted back into the night with Finn as his hostage. The trap had been sprung, but on them. Hours later, a sandstorm howled across the borderlands, whipping grit into eyes and lungs like punishment from God himself. Colt rode alone into the bandit camp, hidden in a narrow canyon, wind screaming around him. He moved like the ranger he once was, silent, precise, deadly. He slipped past the outer guards, using the storm as cover. Inside the flickering firelight, he saw Finn tied to a post, small and terrified. Colt's heart clenched. He created chaos the only way he knew how. He cut the horses loose first. Then he tossed a lantern into a pile of gunpowder crates. The explosion lit up the canyon like daylight. Gunfire erupted everywhere. Colt fought his way through the panicked bandits' knife and revolver, working in deadly rhythm. He reached Finn, slicing through the ropes with one swift motion. "I've got you, son. Hold on." They were almost clear when a bullet caught Old Ruiz, who had followed Colt despite his age. The old man staggered but kept moving, blood soaking his shirt. They escaped into the howling storm, Finn clutched tight against Colt's chest. Back in their hidden arroyo, Ruiz collapsed against a rock, breathing ragged. Colt pressed a cloth to the wound hands, shaking with memories of every friend he had lost in battles just like this. Ruiz grabbed Colt's wrist with surprising strength. "Listen. Real justice isn't killing every enemy," he whispered, voice fading but clear. "It's making sure the weak ones still get to smile. Protect them, Colt. Let them live and laugh again." Then his eyes closed, chest still rising, but barely. Lila knelt beside Finn, her face streaked with tears and sand. When another bandit scout suddenly appeared from the storm pistol raised at the boy, something inside her finally broke free. She snatched Colt's spare revolver from the ground. Her hands shook violently, but she aimed, and she fired. The man dropped. Lila stared at the gun in her hand, stunned. For the first time since her husband's death, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for her new family. Colt looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman who had once been too afraid to lose anything else, now standing ready to risk everything. The storm slowly died as dawn approached. The four of them stood together at the edge of Silver Bend, just outside the town gates. Old Ruiz leaned heavily on Colt, his wound bound but serious. Finn held Lila's hand tightly. Lila's face was set with quiet determination. Colt stared at the silent streets ahead. Silas Crow would know by now. The whole territory probably had their heads on wanted posters. There was no more hiding, no more running. Tomorrow at dawn they would face him in the open square, win, or watch Silver Bend drown in blood and corruption forever. Colt felt the weight of every choice pressing down on him. But for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't carrying it alone. This story teaches us that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to protect others, even when your own scars scream for you to run. The first light of dawn painted the sky blood red over Silver Bend. Colt Ramsey stood in the middle of the dusty square, boots planted firm and the old revolver heavy at his hip. Behind him stood Lila Ford, her hand resting lightly on Finn McCoy's shoulder. Old Ruiz leaned on a wooden crutch, his face pale from the wound, but his eyes steady as ever. A small group of miners, the ones who had finally chosen to stand, flanked them in silence. Across the square, Silas Crow waited with the last of his hired guns. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes a man's mouth go dry and his heart beat too loud in his ears. Silas smiled that cold, confident smile. "You should have kept riding, Ramsey. Now look at you, hiding behind a woman, a boy, and an old Mexican." Colt didn't raise his voice. He spoke clearly, so every soul gathered at the edges of the square could hear. "I'm not hiding, Crow. I'm done hiding. These people deserve to know what you really are." He held up the ledger they had taken from the wagon's pages, stained with sand and truth. "You didn't just steal silver claims. You sold guns to killers on both sides of the border. You murdered innocent men to keep your secret. And you tried to hang a 12-year-old boy because his father wouldn't sell his mine to you." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Lila stepped forward, her voice ringing with quiet strength she had never known she possessed. "I will testify in any court that will listen. I saw the fires. I saw the blood. Silas Crow took my husband from me, and he would have taken everything else if we let him." She looked straight at Silas, no longer afraid. "I'm not scared of you anymore." Finn's small hands trembled, but he stepped out from behind Lila. His voice cracked at first, then grew stronger with every word. "My pa. He only wanted to feed me. He worked that mine honest. You killed him. You tried to kill me too. I was so scared. But Mr. Colt came. Miss Lila took care of me. Old Ruiz taught me not to hate. I'm tired of being scared." Tears ran down the boy's face, but he didn't look away from Silas. Many in the crowd lowered their heads. Some miners who had stayed silent for years now stepped forward, standing with Colt's group. Silas's face twisted with rage. Enough of this circus, he signaled his men. Guns were drawn. The square exploded with gunfire. Colt moved on instinct, shielding Finn and Lila with his body while returning fire. Old Ruiz fired from one knee, despite the pain tearing through his side. The awakened miners joined the fight, their shots echoing off the wooden buildings. Through the chaos, Colt pushed forward. He reached Silas, knocked the man's gun aside, and drove him to the ground with a hard punch. Silas stared up at him, breathing heavily, fear finally showing in his eyes. Colt's finger rested on the trigger. For one long, terrible moment, everything inside him screamed to end it, to finally silence the man who had caused so much pain. Memories flooded him, the friends he had lost, the nights he had drunk himself, numbed the rope around Finn's neck. But then he heard the boy's voice again in his mind. "I don't want more blood." Colt slowly lowered the gun. "No," he said, voice rough but certain. "I'm not you. You're going to face real justice this time. The territory court, the truth, all of it." He stepped back as the remaining townspeople moved in, disarming Silas and his last loyal men. The shooting stopped. The dust began to settle. Silas Crow was taken away in chains, his empire of fear crumbling in the morning light. The gun-running network would soon be hunted down and broken apart by federal marshals once the full evidence reached them. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, the four of them sat together on the newly repaired porch of Lila's place. The saloon still carried the faint smell of smoke and fresh lumber, but it stood again, stronger, like the people inside it. Old Ruiz rested in a chair, his wound freshly bandaged, a quiet smile on his weathered face. Finn sat on the steps, carving a small wooden horse with a knife Ruiz had given him. Lila poured coffee for everyone, her movements calm and sure. Colt looked out across the wide desert that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The same desert that had once felt like a prison now looked free. He reached down slowly and unbuckled the old gun belt from around his waist. For a long moment, he held it in his hands, feeling the weight of every year, every regret, every life it had taken. Then he stood, walked a few steps into the soft sand in front of the saloon, and dug a shallow hole with his boot. He placed the revolver and belt inside, covering them gently with red desert earth. When he returned to the porch, Lila looked at him with soft understanding. "You don't need that anymore," she said quietly. Colt sat down beside her. Finn leaned against his leg. Old Ruiz gave a small nod of approval. "No," Colt answered, his voice low and peaceful for the first time in years. "I don't." The wind moved gently across the square, carrying away the last traces of smoke. In that quiet moment, they weren't just survivors. They had become a family, not by blood, but by the choice to protect one another when everything else tried to tear them apart. This story shows us that real justice begins the moment one person dares to stand up. And that family is not something we are born into, but something we build when we choose courage, forgiveness, and love over fear and hatred. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.